Hello, I'm Dr. Cynthia Talao. I will be presenting my postdoctoral work on guidelines for urban planners, specifically related to soundscape consequences of urban decisions, and that is the work that I'm conducting at UCAM in collaboration with McGill University. So, as I'm sure many in this room know, sound plays a critical role in shaping the urban experience. However, it is rarely considered proactively in city making. And here, I want to pause and say that when I'm going to be talking about city makers and city making, I'm thinking of, for example, urban planners, but basically any type of decision maker who's going to have a say in how our cities are designed and planned. And so I might use those words interchangeably in the rest of my presentation. So, as I was saying, city makers do know and are aware of the importance of sound, but one big hurdle is that they feel and they actually are oftentimes ill equipped to think about it in a proactive manner, and that is due partially to a lack of resources and knowledge. And to respond to that, to try and bridge that gap, the soundscape field has tried to integrate soundscape knowledge into urban practice, including through offering concrete directions. And my work really falls under that umbrella of, concrete directions. And the way I approach it is I try to take it from another direction. Usually, soundscape researchers make a diagnosis of a space, establish how people experience that space, and then those results can be used by urban planners. I'm trying to take it from the other end, where I look at recommendations for interventions urban planners and other city makers, have in mind for different spaces and purposes. And looking at those recommendations, I try to, think through how they can impact the soundscape. And I think that's a very powerful way to approach this because it mirrors how city makers plan their projects and give them a tool that can, fit their practice and their, workflow to help them consider how their urban decisions do impact the soundscape. I'm going to be aiming to do that in this work through capitalizing on, their own knowledge about sound and combine it with our own knowledge about sound from a soundscape perspective. And so this work really aims to create a set of guidelines that will fit in their workflow, how they think through the factors they need to consider in their work. And as far as I'm aware, this is the first direct analysis of this kind, looking at existing urban planning and design guidelines through the lens of, thinking through how they impact the soundscape. This project is quite exploratory. It's really a proof of concept, and so I've gone through one guide so far, and that's the Urban Street Design Guide, which is developed by the U.S. National Association of City Transportation Officials, or NACDO. This guide looks a bit like this, where it goes through, different types of streets. And for example, here you have a transit corridor, and it offers recommendations for different design interventions. And so I went through and listed all those design recommendations, and then I assessed each of them on how it could potentially impact the soundscape, whether positive or negative, for different types of users, like pedestrians or cyclists or car users or building users, like anything that was relevant. And of course, I thought through the different sound producing activities. The main one we can think of in a street, right, is traffic. But there's other potential sources like human activities or natural sounds that can also be brought or modified in the space. So that means that some sources are both source and receiver. So to take it back to, for example, the pedestrians, obviously we know that pedestrians are exposed to traffic, especially in a street, right? But they also bring sound in the space, whether it's, footsteps, voices, whatever. They bring new sounds, and they can be a big part of the sound environment. And that's not saying it's necessarily positive or negative, right? It can be either depending on the context. I also tried to think through the different potentially unintended consequences of different recommendations. So, for example, if we think of removing a traffic lane in a street, you know that it will reduce traffic noise in that street at one point in time, but it might spread the traffic and therefore the noise to other times of the day in that same street, as well as to other streets in the neighborhood. And all of this analysis is based on the soundscape body of literature and anything adjacent that could be relevant like acoustics. So everything is referenced as much as possible in the guide itself, in my guide, the one I made about, sound design, so that people can go back and dig deeper if they need to. And so this list of interventions, which, like I said, in the design guide is organized by street type, in my soundscape guide is organized by different intervention types. And we have 5 categories. We have public transit, bike, pedestrian, traffic, and biodiversity. And so, like I just said, the structure of my guide is a bit different from the one from the urban design guide. Mine is organized by category of interventions. And so each category of intervention has its own table. As you can see here, for example, we have 3 different tables. We have public transit interventions, bike interventions, and then pedestrian interventions. I didn't show all the tables and all the interventions. I will talk a bit about it in future slides. And so you see that each table has intervention recommendations listed as rows, and then soundscape consequences as columns. And as you might imagine, some of the soundscape consequences can pertain to only one category, which is, for example, the case with this one, promoting collective mobility. It makes sense that it would mostly, if not only, fall under public transit. But some others, like for example this one, reducing honking and/or congestion, will be achieved through interventions that can fall in multiple categories. It's not just traffic interventions, right? It's also public transit interventions, or actually almost all types of interventions. And then under those tables, I tried to give a bit more detail as to what each potential soundscape consequence means. I really tried not to be prescriptive, because the way I see it, each urban planner, each decision maker for each project will know their project better than I could ever know it, better than any generalized theory could ever know it. And so they will be able to think through better what each intervention of that project can do on the soundscape of that project. They just need a little bit of guidance. So I really tried to give more general guidance, as well as, like I said, references for people who want to dig deeper into a specific explanation or specific soundscape or acoustic information from the body of literature. Now I'm going to go quickly, like I said, through the different types of interventions to give you a general idea of the content of that guide. So under public transit, I put anything that basically improved the public transit network. It's pretty self-explanatory. And the main consequences of such interventions would be to reduce traffic noise generally by taking away some lanes from traffic and giving it to public transit. And also, a lot of them will promote human sounds just by virtue of improving the safety of the public transit network, and sometimes the pedestrian network that is connected to it. We can see this in this example, for example, in the pictures, which is an example from Montreal, where you see the redesign of a 2x3 street to add a median transit lane, and you can see that both a safer bus network and bus stop and a safer pedestrian crossing have been implemented. So you can imagine that it will both reduce traffic noise and bring human sources through basically reducing the space for individual vehicles and increasing safety for pedestrians. Under bike interventions, I categorized anything that would improve the bicycle network. It's pretty self-explanatory as well. In the same vein as public transit intervention, what generally happens is that bike-related interventions take space away from cars and therefore reduce traffic noise. And that is done to oftentimes prioritize both cycling and pedestrian safety, and therefore bringing more human sounds and promoting active mobility. And that's what we can see in this other example from Montreal, where you can see that a traffic lane has been removed on the street in the left to increase the size and safety of the bike lane. And as you can see, and I'm going to be talking a bit more about it in the next slides, this is intertwined with pedestrian and biodiversity consequences. So for pedestrian interventions, here we see in the same example that the bike interventions went hand in hand with pedestrian interventions. In general, this means distancing the pedestrians from traffic. And here, as you can see that having a bicycle lane does that, right? It puts the traffic further away from the pedestrians, and it renders the space safer for pedestrians, just generally, and therefore promotes human sounds in addition to reducing traffic noise. And as well, like I mentioned, biodiversity interventions and their potential soundscape consequences usually are entwined with other types of interventions. In the example in those images, you can see that the median built to separate the bike lane from the car lane is filled with biodiversity instead of, just being concrete, for example. And so oftentimes in the urban design guide, biodiversity considerations really pertain more to quote unquote details, such as materials for other types of interventions, where, for example, the guide would suggest using porous pavement so that rainwater can be collected and biodiversity can grow, or using planted furniture instead of just plain furniture. And so the last category of interventions, which is by far the biggest, is the one pertaining to traffic, uh, which makes sense because this is an urban street design guide, right? So most of the interventions recommended in the design guide under this category aim to reduce the footprint of traffic in terms of both conflicts over space and space use, and lack of safety for other types of uses. And ultimately, the idea is to improve the livability and attractiveness of the streets. And that is illustrated by both examples from the previous slides, which is why I put them back here, where all those interventions from the previous categories are very much intertwined with traffic interventions, usually taking space away from traffic to take it to use it for those interventions. So the general idea is to reduce traffic noise and bring more human sounds and natural sounds. So in conclusion, and as I have mentioned in the introduction before, we are seeing an increased effort to bridge the gap between soundscape research and urban practice. Maybe for the last, at least 10 years, we have seen efforts to offer concrete advice to urban practitioners in terms of soundscape. And my work really tries to do that as well, and tries to do it from a lens of looking at urban intervention recommendations and thinking through how each intervention could impact the soundscape. And I really want to do it from the lens of the existing knowledge and practices of the city makers that are the ones that are shaping our streets. And that's why I'm aiming to create a guide here that mirrors what an actual planning and design guide can look like, that looks like and frames the information in a way that urban practitioners know and understand and can implement in their own practice, in their own workflow. And so to do that, I will be conducting interviews with city makers, specifically, related to urban street design, and try to extend it to other design guides, right? Because this is one type of doing things. This is one type of workflows, but I need to also look at other types of, practices and workflows. And then I also want to try and do that again with other types of urban interventions, thinking specifically, for example, about green spaces, but I'm sure there are many aspects that I'm not thinking of yet. Thank you for listening.